Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan features two radio professionals with over 100 years of broadcasting experience between them. Dave Hogan and Randy Houston are both native Western North Carolinians whose rich voices have been heard in every glade, cove, and holler of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, primarily on AM radio. And between the two of them, they've worked in just about every radio format. As you can imagine, these guys have tons of stories about the day-to-day of live radio and the interactions they've had with listeners and entertainers while they were immersed in, at the time, one of the most influential and informative mediums available. Those experiences will be featured in this podcast series. Check the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts with Randy and Dave on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Welcome to another episode of Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. I'm Randy Houston.
And I'm Dave Hogan. A big Hogan howdy to everybody. Hope you're feeling good on this nice day. And every day is a nice day if you set your mind. Abraham Lincoln said, a man or woman can be just as happy or sad as they want to be. It's up to us. So I try to make every day a nice day. How about you?
Absolutely, and Happy New Year to you, Dave, and to our listeners and folks that we've come across in the past many years of our years in broadcasting and in radio. And that's kind of one of the, it is what we want to talk with you about today.
Yeah, we're going to talk about small town radio and some of the things. Now, when I say small town, I'm not talking about Asheville or Johnson City or Kingsport or Bristol. We're talking about Murphy, Franklin, Marshall, Burnsville, West Jefferson, really small towns. But Randy, before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about something else.
Okay. You got the mic,
You know, I love to read biographies, and I want you to look. This is the biography. If I sound like my tailgate's a dragon on this broadcast, I don't know when people are going to be listening to it, but we're recording this in the early afternoon, and I slept until 9:35 this morning.
That's a retired morning guy saying that, yes.
Now, the reason is because, my favorite kind of reading is biography. And I want you to look at the biography I'm reading right now that I read till about 2 o'clock this morning is the reason I slept till 9:35. So this is the biography I'm currently reading.
John Newton, right?
John Newton.
Tell me about John Newton.
The book is called From Disgrace to Amazing Grace. John Newton is the man who wrote Amazing Grace.
Okay.
This is one of the most fascinating stories. If we have listeners who like to read, and I'm sure we do, get this biography either at your library or online. I have it on my tablet. It's called From Disgrace to Amazing Grace. And it's the story of John Newton by Jonathan Aitken. And the disgrace is the fact that John Newton was, I guess we would use the term scoundrel.
Oh, really?
Oh, man. He was involved in the slave trade, and he was the captain of several slave ships. Bringing African Americans to the New World, as they called it.
Right.
The United States, what's now the United States, as well as some of the Caribbean countries. So he was, he was a rounder, as we'd say, in a lot of ways. And then he survived a terrible storm, almost died, and started turning his life around. And his conversion to Christianity was not instant. It was over a matter of, in fact, several years from the time he felt like he needed to change his life until he did. And it's an amazing read because when he started preaching there in England, of course, the established church was the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which is still, of course, in existence, and the Church of England. And John Newton was not allowed to be what we would call a pastor or a rector in the Church of England because he did not have the academic credentials to be ordained in the Church of England. Well, you know what he did, John Newton? He started preaching when he felt the call to minister. He started preaching at Presbyterian churches, Baptist churches, Moravian churches, Quaker churches, just anywhere that he could get an audience. And his story was so compelling, and the only comparison I could think of as I read this is Billy Graham. He was so compelling in his ministry that he started attracting all these people from all walks of life to come to wherever he was preaching. And he made the acquaintance of, and I can't remember the actual name, of the Duke of Dartmouth. Dartmouth College in New Hampshire was named in his honor. But he was a wealthy, high-standing person in England, and he and many other people of stature in England started going to services conducted by John Newton. So he finally was ordained as a minister, and he pastored a small church in Olney, England. And if that name, Olney, rings a bell with some people, that's where they have the famous pancake race. That's where the pancake race started.
Okay.
And supposedly this lady was flipping a pancake, and she heard the church bell ring at the church pastored by John Newton, and started running to the church to make it on time, and still had the frying pan flipping pancakes. That's the legend anyway.
Okay.
And so to this day, they have that pancake race in Olney, England. But let me make the long story short. During his ministry, he also wrote hymns, and he wrote Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace is a song everybody knows, everybody can sing, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And he wrote Amazing Grace, but it was not a big song in England. They put together, he and another member of his congregation who also wrote songs, they put together the Olney, O-L-N-E-Y, Olney Hymns. And it became a very famous songbook in England. But Amazing Grace was not that popular until somehow the song made its way to the United States during the colonial times before the Revolution. And the melody that we use today for Amazing Grace, John Newton did not put melodies to his songs, and Amazing Grace was sung to a number of different melodies in England. But in the United States, a songbook was put together, and I apologize, I don't recall the person's name who put the songbook together, called Southern Hymns, and it included Amazing Grace, and he used the melody of an instrumental from the Appalachian Mountains, brought over from Scotland, called New Britain was the name of the song, and New Britain melody is what we use today
for
Amazing Grace. And Amazing Grace is one of the few songs, think about this, one of the very few songs that can be sung either as a happy celebratory song or a sad song. It can be sung at funerals. It can be sung at sad occasions. Remember President Obama in Charleston, South Carolina,
exactly.
In the black church.
Right.
And when he was doing a eulogy, broke into singing Amazing Grace at that very sad occasion. Amazing Grace was sung after the attack on 9/11 by just about every congregation in America. in a sad occasion, but on the other hand, it can be used at weddings and celebrations of all sorts. So if you have an inclination to learn about this man, a fascinating man named John Newton, pick up that book at your library and read it, or buy it, or get it online, and you'll be amazed at the story.
There's a soloist on the Gaither Homecoming videos who tells a story also about where John Newton got the inspiration to write that song, that it was the sounds of the slaves coming from the belly of the ship that gave him that inspiration, and that it is one of the very, very few songs that can be played on all black keys on the keyboard.
And the black population in slavery in the United States was instrumental in the popularity of the song Amazing Grace. It was a song that was sung originally to a great degree by slaves.
Well, we have
John Newton, by the way, one more point.
Okay.
The church he pastored originally, he later on pastored in London, but the small church was in a very poor town. He tried to make his sermons simple, understandable by everybody, and he applied that to the songs he wrote. Amazing Grace, the original version, has 145 words. 126 of the 145 words, one syllable.
Wow.
Think about that.
That's
145 words. Try to write 145 words down.
That are one syllable.
And 126 out of the 145 are one syllable. And that's the case with Amazing Grace.
And to tell the story that Amazing Grace tells.
How sweet the sound. Oh, by the way, and I keep talking about Amazing Grace, and I guess because if it wasn't for grace, I'd be in a pickle.
Wouldn't we all? It is amazing.
I would be in a pickle, even worse than a pickle. But thank God for Amazing Grace. But the verse that I think touches many of us is when we've been there 10,000 years. Remember that line in the
Bright
song?
shining as the star.
Bright shining as the sun. That was not written by John Newton. That was written by the lady who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Harriet.
The book,
Yeah.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right.
Was written by, help me, Randy.
And it's not written by Harriet Stover.
I can look it up real quick here. While you talk about small town radio, which was going to be the subject of this, we probably need to save that subject for another show, because we started talking about Amazing Grace, which has been on my mind as a result of reading this. Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Harriet Beecher Stowe. What did I say?
Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose brother was a songwriter, but she wrote that verse.
Bright shining
when we've
as
been
the
there
sun.
10,000 years, bright shining as the sun.
We've no less days to shed the,
We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
Yeah.
We love that verse, and we sing that verse when we sing Amazing Grace.
And there's a third verse to that song that we don't often sing in church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who authored Uncle Tom's Cabin. And if you haven't read Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the things I've done in retirement, Randy, is go back and try to read some of the classics that I never read before.
Yeah.
Uncle Tom's Cabin is one of them that I read recently. And the story was a great influence in the emancipation movement in the United States, the abolition of slavery. And Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "You're the you're the lady that started this war, referring to the Civil War.
Right.
You think we ought to save the small town radio?
I do, because
for another
we're
podcast.
Yeah, we're
I can talk all day about Amazing Grace.
We'll just title this one "Dave's Love of Amazing Grace" and Randy's too.
And as I said, I'd be in a pickle if it weren't for grace, and I think a lot of us would.
I can't agree more. And I pick up that old guitar every now and then, and the very first tune that you learn to play, Amazing Grace.
And
I love
it's
that
sung
song.
in every congregation, doesn't matter the denomination. It's the universal hymn, sung in Baptist. I think you and I both grew up in Baptist churches.
Right.
But it's sung in every denomination, including Catholic churches. Everybody knows and sings Amazing Grace. And from all surveys that have been made, Amazing Grace comes up as the most sung, most popular song ever written.
Wow. Ever. Of all songs.
Of all songs.
That's a bunch of songs.
Now, think about this. You know, you and I worked at WISE in Asheville.
Right.
During the 1990s, that decade of the 90s.
Right.
And you know one of the songs that was popular and played a lot? We called it Songs from the Great American Songbook.
Right.
Judy Collins' recording
Amazing Grace.
of Amazing Grace.
Yes.
It was a big pop hit.
Of course.
Can you imagine a song that
I forgot about that.
that appeals to every person, every genre of music?
Yeah.
But Judy Collins, I believe it was a cappella, wasn't it?
It was. It was like I was about to bring that up. And it was a hit on the contemporary charts in the 70s. We were playing it in the 90s as a recurrent hit.
Exactly.
I forgot about that, Dave. You got such a great memory. Well, thank you for bringing us. You know, you just witnessed really live radio. We had two topics picked out. We were going to do two podcasts today, and we had two topics picked out, and this was neither one of those. We just turned on the mic, started talking, and that's exactly what we do, what we have done for a long, long time around AM, primarily AM radio stations around Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee, and we get together about once a month and go have lunch and tell radio stories, and got to figure it out. We need to put this on recording. Some of our kids one of these days, or grandkids or something, might want to, hey, who was that crazy guy? Hot Mike with Houston and Hogan.
One more point before you sign off. People ask me, since I retired from doing a radio show after over 50 years, do you miss radio? And the one thing I miss most of all is sharing stories with people, like the story we just told about Amazing Grace.
Yeah.
When I read a book or I see something out here when I'm traveling, I want to share it with people.
Yeah.
And I think, boy, I'm going to talk about that on the radio tomorrow morning. And then I realize I'm retired and I don't have any place to talk about it except with Randy Houston on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Come back next time, and we'll talk about some of those small radio station days on Hot Mic. Thank you for joining us.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.